All right, we have a pretty packed agenda today, so I'd like to actually get started. So welcome everyone to the third of WCG Evoca's John Lee webinar series. The focus today is on reducing site burden by proactive planning. And as we're aware, there's plenty of things that are burdensome to sites, from very large scale issues like technology or interoperability. But the focus today is really what can we do today in terms of changing our processes to really be able to make positive change on the impact that sites are feeling downstream, as well as get a lay of the land of what it actually looks like from a resourcing perspective at sites now based on the COVID impact, as well as other resource challenges they're experiencing at this point in time. With that, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce you to the amazing panel of experts that I have presenting here with me today. So Bridget.
Hello, everybody. My name is Bridget Flanagan. My background is in clinical operations, and I'm a senior consultant here at WCG Evoca, and I'm based in Europe. Thank you.
And Sandy.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Sandy Smith, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Clinical Solutions and Strategic Partnering at WCG. I do work mostly with sites, large academic medical centers down to independent sites, and my background is site operations.
Thanks, Sandy. And I am Chrissy McDonald. I'm the Vice President of Client Delivery for the WCG Evoca Group. Today, we actually have a special guest joining us. So as you're aware, this is the third of a series dedicated to John Lee, who was one of the first members of the Evoca Quality Consortium back in 2011. And we've invited his colleague Deirdre here today to really give some insights into who John was and why these activities were important to him. Deirdre, you can take yourself off mute and take it away.
Thanks, Chrissy. So hello, everyone. I'm Deirdre Bavard. I'm currently the Senior Vice President of R&D Strategic Operations at CSL Behring. I had the honor and the pleasure of knowing John for countless years. In fact, in preparation, I was trying to think of when I first met John, and it was over a decade ago. And really, I think, first of all, thanks to Evoca for continuing his legacy in this way. It's really impressive and quite an honor that he, I'm sure, would be proud of. John was all about connecting. I know the Quality Consortium was really a passion of his. I dare say he probably badgered me to try to get me involved more than I was able to. But it was really because John shared. John was a big presence, big personality, but a big giver. And it was really all about connecting ideas, connecting people. And I love even just today's session around positive change and proactive approaches. And that was really very much the nature of the way he operated. I looked back at emails that I actually am really glad I never deleted. And there's over 10 years of exchange between John, myself, and many other clinical operations professionals, willingness to just connect and share, all in the effort to raise all boats, right? To get us all to do a better job. And that better job was really in order to benefit the clinical trial community of sites and providers, and most of all, patients. So sharing of experience is all about John. It's also what Evoca Quality Consortium does. So what a wonderful tribute. And thank you for having me here to speak about him.
Thank you, Deirdre. We appreciate it. For those of you who don't know, Deirdre just alluded a little bit to it, but who is WCG Evoca? So we're a life science consulting firm dedicated to improving quality and compliance in the clinical trial execution process. And we do that in 3 different ways. So the Evoca Quality Consortium, which was just mentioned, through our Evoca Consulting and Research Services, which is focused on GCP quality and compliance, as well as proactive risk management. And lastly, through the Evoca Innovation Alliance, which is looking at how we actually operationalize these next generation clinical trial execution models that are coming about at a more rapid pace because of COVID and the nature of the shift to things like DCT and artificial intelligence. Our mission is really to have a positive impact on all clinical trials by helping companies increase quality, ensure compliance, and improve efficiency. And we do that through this collaborative model of sharing discussions, challenges, and really focused on industry-wide lessons learned so that nobody's making the same mistakes twice. So we do that through three really interrelated elements to provide these high value activities. The first is the consortium construct, where we're getting experts across a variety of different companies sharing their experiences to use for process improvements internally. We do that through practical work products. So AQC members have access to over 400 tools within our knowledge center and templates such as risk-based quality management plans, centralized monitoring plans, quality agreements, and much, much more for use within your organization, so you're not recreating the wheel. The tools have all been developed and peer reviewed through our member services and our member companies and are up to date with a variety of global regulations and guidances. And lastly, we have subject matter experts. So 2 of them are on the phone today, and many others who have 20+ years experience in the industry to bring towards the development of those tools. So the difference in our thought leadership and the execution of developing that work product is it is developed by the Avoca subject matter experts on behalf of our members. So they have access to those materials more rapidly without using the FTE resources that we know are so scarce within organizations today. So just some insights into the over 165 member companies we have. You can see these are the organizations that are currently AQC members. If you see your name on your list and you don't have access to the Knowledge Center, please feel free to contact us after the event today, and we will get you access to the Knowledge Center and the materials within that. If you don't see your name on this list and you're interested in being a part of the collaborative, again, please feel free to contact us and we can get you set up with a demo so you can see what you can experience as a member. So as we stated, John Lee's been with us since the start of the AQC back in 2011 when we were really focused on outsourcing and vendor oversight. It's since expanded to really all sort of global quality management system processes all the way to 2021, where we are today. And as many of you may have seen yesterday, there was a really fabulous announcement that the Avoca Quality Consortium is merging with the Metrics Champions Consortium to really become this powerhouse of a collaborative that has all of the tools that you need to demonstrate inspection readiness and quality and compliance, now aligned with all of the tools that you need to measure that those things are actually happening in both a high quality way as well as with excellent performance. So we're looking forward to that and for all of our members to experience these mutual benefits. So please keep a lookout for more details there. With that, I'm going to pass it to Sandy, because I think in order to understand why it's so important and so urgent for us to really start making even these small incremental changes, it's important to understand what the landscape is out there right now at sites and with investigators so that we can really see why it's such a need at this point in time. So Sandy?
Thanks, Chrissy. Yeah, over the course of the next few minutes, I'd like to give you the perspective of what we've been experiencing working with the sites. There we go. Looking at things from a site perspective, obviously they're faced with a lot of pressures. We know that sites felt constraints prior to the pandemic, but those have only exacerbated over the past 18 months or so. We know that sponsors have many trials to complete, and the timing and the quality of the data are of paramount importance to them. We know that patients want the best care, and clearly many more have learned about the value of clinical trials, but it can be complicated to navigate healthcare right now. At the site level, they continue to have financial pressures, many of them putting large investments in technology. They're reconfiguring their operations, trying to still determine what is the most effective way to configure their operations and learning what the new normal should be. And in some cases, sites are being asked to do more with less. We do know that there has been a tremendous resilience in and adaptability in the face of the pandemic. In fact, what we've seen in terms of clinical trial starts is that there's been an 8% increase from 2019 to 2020, and that was the 4th consecutive year with an increase over 7%. As we look at our WCG knowledge base, we found that in oncology, the trial starts increased over 12% from the previous year. So a very, very robust pipeline. Now, one of the points of concern was the bottleneck that the clinical trials industry faced. We certainly are aware that as 2020 unfolded, many trials were either put on hold or missed their start date as everyone needed to pivot into the new environment that we were forced to work in. We see as you look across the therapeutic areas that metabolic, autoimmune, CNS, they've remained relatively stable year over year, but they all dropped off somewhat in 2020. And clearly we know that these trials need to go on. So there was a bit of backlog that was brought back in 2021, along with a sense of urgency. What we are also seeing is that there is a push forward to get trial starts going at an aggressive pace. So when we look at a quarter by quarter overview, there was an increase of 44% when we look at Q1 of 2020 compared to Q1 of 2021. And then moving into Q2, a 38% increase from Q2 in 2020 into Q2 of 2021. So we expect that this bottleneck in trial operations is going to continue to put pressure on both the sponsors and the sites as they continue to juggle trial restarts. Still, a number of COVID trials are ongoing and starting, and then again, putting in their new operational plans. So the sites are strained for resources. This slide shows a quarter by quarter view of trial starts through Q2 of 2021 with the overlay of staffing levels at hospitals. Well, you may ask the question, why are we looking at staffing at hospitals? We're talking about research programs. Well, hospital staffing can serve as an indicator of staffing in the research programs, even though we know many of these programs in research are not fully staffed by nurses. But waves have occurred since the pandemic. And as you can see, that hospital staffing drop that occurred from Q1 to Q2 of last year was largely a result of reductions in force that were layoffs, early retirements. Some sites forced their staff to take PTOs. So we had that steep slope. And we have not yet recovered back to the pre-pandemic levels. In some cases, staff had freezes that they were not permitted to post new positions. And part of that was related to the declining hospital revenue that occurred. Less surgeries, less screening procedures, and just overall, the revenue at hospitals were severely impacted. And so now, as we look to the future, we are seeing that there is an opening up of positions, and the hospitals are certainly trying to recover, but the gap between the workforce shortages and what the hospitals need has certainly widened. So we really started monitoring this very closely in the spring of this year. And just a snapshot of April shows you that's the time that things were beginning to open up a little bit more. We saw the number of healthcare jobs opening rose to about 1.3 million from about 1.2 in March. So a difference of 32,000, a significant increase. However, when we look at the number of people that were hired in April in these healthcare positions, 650,000 new hires. However, the reductions or turnovers were close behind at 634,000. So really only a net gain of 16,000 were added to the permanent workforce. But what changed from 2020, where there were forced reductions, now we're seeing voluntary separations. And in fact, 72% of those separations were voluntary. So this has really put hospitals and subsequently research programs in a precarious position. And unfortunately, the end isn't in sight. In fact, on September 1st, the American Nurses Association urged the US Department of Health and Human Services to declare a nurse staffing shortage so that more focus and resources could be devoted to trying to alleviate what will be a long-term issue. I thought I would share some information from a nurses survey that was conducted in August of 2021. This was a survey of 6,000 nurses. And I think the most salient point I wanted to highlight was 2/3 of the respondents said they feel their pandemic experiences have led them to consider leaving nursing. And so in fact, we are seeing that. Not only have we had those waves that occurred with the forced resignations and then showing the improvements in trying to get positions posted, but now what we're seeing is vaccine mandates are impacting some hospitals with needing to leave some of their team members go. So just not picking out Beaumont or Henry Ford, but I've just captured a few current headlines that have been in Becker's Healthcare within a week's period of time. So hospitals are closing beds due to the staffing shortage. Again, there are people that are leaving healthcare systems due to the vaccine mandates. And we are seeing very, very dire standards being put in place to manage the crisis of care that's currently being experienced. So with this, there has been a term coined called the mass resignation. And there was a nice review in Harvard Business Review that talked about when there is a situation of the proportion that we've experienced with the mandate, that many people will begin to look at their future and are they doing what they want to do? So we believe that is contributing to some degree to these voluntary separations. Also, there's a lot of burnout and fatigue among healthcare professionals, and they may be just looking for something different to be doing. So now let's bring this back to research. At WCG, we've certainly been trying to keep our finger on the pulse of what's been going on at the sites. And this is a recent survey that was just conducted last month. You see from the survey that 100% of the sites that participated identified staffing as their largest concern. When I conducted this survey in April, it was hovering at about 50%. So between the individuals we've been working with, definitely I felt that we'd see that number rise, and it has. You can see that sites continue to be concerned about the technology burden. While we all acknowledge that technology can lend itself to efficiencies, right now there's a lot of investment in technology, and while staff are trying to deal with their shortages, they're still trying to support investment and implementation of new technologies. And clearly the issue of trial enrollment continues to be of concern to many of the sites. I thought I would capture just a few comments. These are from sites that I had interacted with. One site said that since July 1st, they have put all new studies on hold and a hold on all new accruals. And if a physician has a patient that they think absolutely needs to be put on trial, that approval needs to go through several reviews before it's granted. It's not uncommon to hear sites say that they are 50% short on their CRCs. Or one individual I was talking to said, I have lost 50% of my experienced people, and we are onboarding a lot more junior folks that will just take a lot longer to ramp up. There's also a reliance on the nurses within the hospitals. And what they're seeing is with hospital staffing being in the position that it is, in some hospitals, they are using temporary contract and travel nurses. 30–35% of their direct care positions are being filled by these interim staff. And therefore, the procedures, the services that they used to do to support clinical trials, they can no longer do. So the sites are having to go back to their research teams and actually look at the skill set and retool their research teams in order to take on an even greater role in patient care, just because the hospital staff cannot make that contribution. Quotes like, we have a broad need for people in research. We'll take licensed or unlicensed. Some sites saying they've had postings up for over a year. And this one quote, we are inundated with new studies without the adequate staff to begin the study process. Several sites have commented on the number of studies they have in the pipeline, so it's not an issue of studies being available to them, but it really has to do with their ability to open. And thankfully, they are being very thoughtful to not open trials unless they do have the complement of team members that they need to do the trial safely and to be successful. But several sites have mentioned having upwards of 100 trials that are just on hold at the present time. So that brings us to a very interesting crossroads in our industry. We've talked a lot about site capacity, and I also want to make mention of the impact on physician availability. We have data that shows that about 41% of physicians only engage in one clinical trial. And so can we get more physicians to engage in more trials? But overall, it is a challenge at the sites due to the trial complexity, the additional burdens that we've talked about. And I won't necessarily say that there is a lack of patients, but it's probably more a lack of access that patients are getting to clinical trials given the current burdens that we're having. And I guess the biggest concern that we have is the potential for quality issues as we go on. So what can we do? And then I'll turn it back over to Christy.
Thanks, Sandy. So as I said in the beginning, what can we do? The focus today is really not on these very broad changes that require, frankly, industry change, right? It requires buy-in from not only sponsors and CROs, but sites and investigators and patients as well, but really focusing on this internal view of sponsors and CROs and what we can do to impact some small incremental change. In a recent conversation with some investigative sites focused on site burden for our upcoming Avoca Summit, there was a conversation about as they try to get new investigators to participate in clinical research, they often get pushback because they start the startup activities and say, this is just too much work. It's too much work to do this versus the time I could spend seeing patients. So what we want to do with some of our changes is be able to really positively impact what sites do best. And that's interacting with the patients, making sure the patient care is there, they're safe, and we're collecting quality data for our things to move on. So today we're focusing really on just 3 different pieces that we've heard throughout our conversations that are burdensome for sites. The first is the feasibility process. The second is how we determine to train our sites. And the last piece is safety. So we'll give a little bit of insight into what that looks like to a site in terms of burden and what tiny changes we can make proactively just by going back to our organizations today and making some suggestions to push for change based on what we're seeing to really make sure that our sites are spending the time that they have, which we recognize is little at the moment, on things that matter. And the things that matter are getting that data, treating those patients, and finding those patients that we need for our trials. Excuse me, a little bit of lag there. So as I said, the first part is really just looking at trial feasibility assessments. And I think this is frankly just one of the many redundant processes that we do in clinical trials. And we've seen this and we've quantified this before, not necessarily looking at sites, but looking at qualifying vendors and how everyone is conducting the same process over and over again, expecting to find something different than either the sponsor or the CRO before them. So back in January of this year, there was a survey done through ASCO that really collected the current burden of feasibility assessments, looking across 103 different research sites here. And you can see across those 103 sites, the estimate of time spent annually was 12,360 hours, which actually equated to about $500,000, assuming an estimate of a research coordinator at $45 an hour. You can go on to look at the pre-study site visits, which was across the 103 sites estimated to be about 14,832 hours, equating to about $660,000. So when you combine that across just 103 sites, which we have to know there are more out there, we're looking at 27,192 hours at an estimated cost of $1.2 million. So not even looking at the costs right now, but really exclusively that time. is it worth 27,192 hours of their time for us to all have a different feasibility questionnaire where likely 80 to 90% of those questions are the same that they're getting asked from every other organization? If you actually looked a little bit deeper into those hours and asked them what they thought, so this 103 sites here, would they be interested in a centralized portal that collects that data that is 80 to 90% the same across every sponsor and every trial? 84% said yes. If you asked if they wanted to be interested in certification by an outside party like an ASCO, you had 72% yes. So there's a desire and a want for the sites for us to collaborate and come up with a better way to do this process. And I'll pass it to Bridget, who will talk to us a little bit about what that process looks like today and some of the suggestions that they made to make some improvements to save that time.
Thank you, Chrissy. So this is a very telling statement that ASCO issued. There's an urgency to improve the current feasibility assessment process, which is costly, inconsistent, inefficient, labor-intensive, and of uncertain effectiveness. And good enough, they proposed some alternate solutions. The current process, as you know, is this long feasibility questionnaire asking many of the questions that have been previously answered by teams to even the same companies. And then following on from that is a PSSV, again, asking all the same questions that you'd already completed on your feasibility questionnaire form. So they have proposed, for example, one option to be a short form, a standardized feasibility questionnaire to assess whether the site has an infrastructure, a research infrastructure, like with SOPs and appropriate staff, then whether the protocol is feasible at that site and are they interested. And if they say yes, and they have the infrastructure and they can do the protocol, then you would do a standardized PSSV, and you might ask more of the detailed questions, assess, access to the EMR, all of those kind of things when you're on site, and then you make a decision point. Next slide, please. So the second option they have suggested is just the long feasibility questionnaire. Again, standardize the form and make a decision. And then the third option might be a PSSV or a teleconference, but only when the sponsor or the CRO has worked with the site in the past 24 months. And again, make it standardized and arrive at a decision. And then another option to consider, aside from what ASCO has proposed, is to make better use of the PSSV process. So when you're on the site, you're going to solicit input from the investigator and the research coordinators on the actual feasibility of the protocol at that site. E8R1, which hasn't yet been released, but has been in the works for a long time, does recommend that input be sought from these stakeholders. And actually ASCO is a huge stakeholder. So that you use your time effectively at the site. If it's like an ER study, follow the patient's process through the enrollment and see, does it make sense? Is there time? Will all the results be to hand to get this patient enrolled within whatever window of time you have? And then listen to the feedback from the sites, because investigators really do like when they feel they've been heard and that a particular procedure or a particular requirement that a patient fasts for 12 hours and then sit another 4 hours in a waiting room before they're seen, that's not very practical. So it's important to make better use of those PSSVs, and it's currently happening. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk briefly about training.
Yep, thanks, Bridget. Yeah, so I think the situation here is we're all accustomed to training. We live in an industry where you are constantly doing training on new SOPs. Sometimes it's read and sign. Sometimes there are situations where you have to take a subset of questions to confirm that you do understand what you're doing. Now, imagine you're working at a CRO, and so you're likely managing more than one study. And imagine the time that it takes to take one of those trainings, not a read and sign. You're going to actually have to answer some questions. And as a matter of fact, it's going to force you to listen to the person speak before you can click next to go to the next slide. So it's one of those. And imagine it's the same process that you're going to get trained on, but now every time you start working on a new study at this CRO you're working with, they're going to ask you to take that training again. So effectively, within a year, you're going to take the same training, let's say monthly, on how to understand the GCP process, right? As you can imagine, it's pretty burdensome. I'm sure if you're like me, those trainings sometimes fall to the bottom of the priority list as you're dealing with your day-to-day activities. So this is pretty much what sites experience across a variety of different topics. So you can have an investigator who's working on 15 studies who will get asked to take GCP training in 15 different ways across those 15 different studies. If it's an oncology study, they may be forced to take some sort of RECIST training 15 times across those 15 different studies. And there's no necessarily consistency or ability to track whether or not that investigator has already done it for your organization and they need to do it again. So what we're looking at here is evaluating on a risk-based way how this site training should look. So go ahead, Bridget.
Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so the current process is collection of GCP certificates for everyone on the 1572 and on the delegation of authority log. Training certificates sometimes are rejected because another company's logo is on it. The training is repeated when, quote unquote, the certificate expires, even though the regulations mightn't have changed. And then you have sponsor and CRO staff who are unfamiliar with ACRP certification, and certified professionals don't need to undergo GCP training because they're maintaining their certification status, and so that's not necessary. And then also, it can't be one size fits all. You really need to tailor the training to that person's role. If they're just taking vital signs and at that standard of care, do you really need to train them on GCP? So you really need to think critically about who actually needs to be trained, not just on GCP, but on the protocol. And, it's become seen as a regulatory requirement instead of a human performance management endeavor. We're training people on a particular protocol, and we need to be confident that they've understood what we have said, and we need to engage them. Sadly, the industry is resistant to change. You can see the quote there, and has low expectations for training results. Next slide, please. Okay, so the risks of the current approach, is, death by PowerPoint, essentially. And, you have people who are not engaged, who may be multitasking. You can't see them often, if they don't have their videos on. And how can you be sure they're not multitasking and answering emails when you're doing your presentation? So that kind of scenario, really, there's low to no retention of content, and it leaves teams unprepared, and you PIs then who are frustrated and they feel that their time is being wasted. And then tracking completion is not the same as thorough metrics tracking comprehension and competency. So what can we do to make it a little different? Next slide. We need to encourage critical thinking. And that applies across the board with the feasibility, with the training. And again, when it comes to safety, we need to encourage critical thinking, use different methodologies, whether it's simulation training, make it interactive, and think about, these are adult learners, and you want to tailor the training to meet their needs. And the other important thing to consider is that an engaged investigator screens and enrolls have doubled the rates of non-engaged investigators. And that relationship has begun back when you did the feasibility assessment. Did you listen to them? Did you hear their concerns? Did you take action on that? And now you've come out to train them, and you do a 40 or 50 slide, SIV initiation presentation, and you've lost their interest. Whereas somebody who can do it like dynamic training, encourage questions, get the investigator involved, potential, challenges that you might encounter, and really have a dynamic conversation, you're more likely to have investigators who will enroll successfully. And I think it's back to you, Chrissy. Oh, it's me again, safety.
Yeah, no, I can hop in here.
Okay.
So just to give a little bit of background of what this safety reporting crisis looks like, and to be totally transparent, this was a new insight to us as part of our involvement with WCG. And as a matter of fact, we have become so passionate about the impact that this small change can make that we've created a safety leadership advisory board that will be creating a reference model to indicate what safety letters need to be distributed where and when, based on really the region that they're in. So the research that's been done actually found that about 85% of IND safety reports that are being sent to US investigators are not necessary. So what we're asking them to do is read and acknowledge in either a technology or manually reports that are not meaningful. And what happens there is that there's two risks. The first is that the boy who cried wolf risk, if you will, where there is actually a really meaningful safety report in there somewhere that does not get recognized by an investigator because they're accustomed to 85% of what they're seeing being something that was actually expected per the investigator's brochure. The second is really that perhaps they're not going to get acknowledged. And what we're seeing here is that there are actually some academic centers who've actually refused to acknowledge safety reports until there is some sort of risk-based assessment completed by the sponsor or the CRO before distributing it to them. So you see that the over-reporting issue causes there's about 18 to 20% or 20,000 safety reports per year that are distributed to sites. And if you look at 85% of those not being distributed according to regulations, that's a really high percentage activity that they're doing with about an hour per safety report to review, analyze, sign, et cetera. That's a big quantity of time that they're using there for an activity that's not necessarily bringing value or the value that we would expect from the site. We want them spending that time looking for patients, treating patients, et cetera. What some organizations have done, as you can see on the slide, have actually said, we're not going to use your system to acknowledge safety reports unless you basically clean up the process. Or alternatively, they've made it a business decision where they've drastically increased the price per safety letter to review. So what we need to do is really look at this burden, and this is particularly relevant in oncology trials, and figure out what can we do as sponsors and CROs to make sure that we're only providing to sites the pieces of information that are actually most important to them. So, Bridget? You are on mute.
Sorry about that. So this is an article that was published in BMJ in 2019, and the authors were representing almost 1,000 senior researchers in hematology across Europe. And the title of the article was "Bureaucracy is Strangling Clinical Research." We receive information on side effects that have been known about for years. We get notification of suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reactions that are neither serious nor unexpected, and we field countless clinically insignificant queries, all of which we know have to be acknowledged in the safety portal, and that takes time as well. Next slide. Another comment was that these processes take up an inordinate amount of time and help explain some of the rising costs of clinical trials and new drugs. And they do make some scathing comments there about intermediaries asking questions who have little knowledge of diseases relevant to the trials, and that leads to endless unnecessary questions and further paperwork. Next slide. And finally, what they call for a new framework. The justification is always that it's about patient safety. And as Chrissy said earlier, you know, that a truly important signal is lost in the deluge of paperwork that they're receiving. And they think there needs to be a new process so that the focus is back on the patients and those with the primary responsibility of looking after them. And back to you, Chrissy.
It's my turn to be on mute now. So just a brief summary here. So as we heard from Sandy, demand is drastically outpacing the supply. So at this rate, sites are challenged to support clinical trials and clinical research. So we really need to do everything with our power to make it easier for them, make it less burdensome, and really take some tangible steps to allow them the time that they need to really do the mission critical activities. The particular areas of quick wins that we talked about today were decreasing the redundant activities when possible. So feasibility, can you look across your organization and see, is there consistency in the questionnaire that you're providing? Are you continuously providing the same questions to sites that you may already have the answers to? And how can you store that information in a way that you don't have to keep asking them the same questions over and over again? For risk-based training, can you look at your process and can you see if there are anything specific in your SOP that's requiring the training for things like GCP be on your sponsor letterhead? Can you be more flexible with what you're accepting as approved training for things that are consistent across the entire clinical trial ecosystem? And can you look at being more meaningful in your training time? One really interesting suggestion from another conversation we've had with sites is that, alluding to Bridget's death by PowerPoint, they would much prefer an SIV that isn't 6 hours of listening to GCP or reading through the protocol with them. And they would love that as an opportunity to really do a makeshift visit for those visits that are difficult or particularly time sensitive when you're dealing with, say, a sample that needs to be collected and frozen and shipped rapidly. So they can work through those logistics where it's more inclined for them to have some sort of protocol deviation. It's a much better use of time for them than just sitting and reading the protocol aloud to them. And last and certainly not least is really increased focus on the meaningful safety letter distribution. It's understandable. We live in a risk-averse industry, and the last thing that we want to do is make the mistake of not sending a safety letter to a site that then becomes a finding in an inspection because we interpreted regulations differently or we accidentally didn't send it. And so our response, much like we've seen as we've tried to move to sort of the risk-based monitoring, is to just send them all. Because if we send them all, we're in a place where we've distributed them and we can't sort of get caught with the hot potato or the regulatory finding, if you will. But there's some really negative impacts to that downstream. So as I said, the potential of missing some sort of signal, nobody wants to end up on the front page of the news because there was a missing safety signal because of over-reporting. And we certainly don't want to be burdening our sites with information that helps them miss what the most important pieces are. That ultimately drains that time that they have as well. So with that being said, we hope that this was helpful. We hope it's maybe inspired you to go back to your organization and really look at those downstream decisions that we're making and how they impact sites, so that we can really get people as excited about clinical research as we are, and get more investigators involved and more CRCs involved, because they want to be a part of this, and they don't see it as a time drain that's taking away from what's most important to them and what drives them, which is seeing those patients, treating those patients, and really helping them to heal. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining our webinar again today. There's some contact information on the bottom here. If you would like any further information on WCG Avoca, our Quality Consortium, our Innovation Alliance, our consulting services, as well as our new partner, NCC. We look forward to speaking to you again soon, and thank you again for joining.